If you read the whole passage of the gospel, there are certain strategic verses left out today. One of the phrases that is inserted by the evangelist in the story is, "Thus he declared all foods clean." So, as you know, in the early church, the very first big crisis was, do the Gentile converts to become Christian have to keep the Mosaic law as the early Jewish converts did? And decided that no, that was no longer necessary. It's not by works of law, but by faith in Jesus Christ and His grace that we are saved, is Paul's whole theology, the former Pharisee. But, this can cause us a certain amount of trouble if we, in our relationships today, with Jews. You heard the long discourse about what Jews do in the gospel. And you say, well, what, are they just mistaken in following the Torah, the Mosaic law? Well, the Second Vatican Council, as you know, pointed out that not only the Jews, but the Hindus and Buddhists, all these wisdom traditions of the world are valid. They have great truth in them. They can be paths of salvation. And I've met personally so many wonderful Orthodox rabbis and ordinary lay people in the Jewish community to know that that's totally true. So, what's a good approach here? Some have said, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, that what Jesus was really doing, Jesus who, don't forget, lived and died, a Jew, he was offering much more a criticism of all religions and the dangers and tendencies that are endemic, it seems, to them, than, taking a stand about this or that particular religion. And that's definitely what's happening today, in the gospel. He's talking about hypocrites, and he's saying, you set aside the law of God, this precious law of God, the Torah, which we heard about in the first reading today from Deuteronomy, and you're following your own traditions, your human teachings, like washing your hand, and it's not Torah. Or part of the verses that are left out, he quotes, well, according to your tradition, it's called Korban, if you dedicate the money you should have spent on supporting your elderly parents, if you dedicate that money to God, you don't have to honor your father and your mother. The fourth commandment. So Jesus says, look what you've done. You've taken your own selfish traditions and used them to replace the law of God. So that's the problem. In any tradition, whether you're talking about Sharia law, whether you're talking about, the Torah, whether you're talking about Christian canon law, whatever you're talking about, the danger is that we substitute human traditions and allow the law of God to be tainted, unwittingly or not, by selfishness and by greed, all the things that Jesus criticizes in the Pharisees in the gospel. But it's a problem for all of us. It's always a temptation to wind up replacing the true law of God with our customs and traditions based on whatever philosophy or law or what canon or whatever it might be, and that's something we always have to look out for. So when it says in the second reading that we have to guard the implanted word, it's not so much about doctrine or beliefs, it's about how we behave. This is what's truly important. That's clearly what Jesus is saying in the gospel. He's saying, look what you've replaced. Look what does defile a person. It's all these evil thoughts and greed and envy and murder and theft, and all that stuff that comes out of our hearts if we're not careful. That's what all religious traditions are supposed to be fighting against, and where their true value lies. And they're effective, or we allow them to be effective in our lives to the extent that those things are rooted out. And that's a very good image that we have here in that second reading. It conforms to what Jesus says in the gospel elsewhere about sowing the word. The word is sown in our hearts and is choked by the cares of the world or by money and greed, or it falls on good soil and slowly grows and bears fruit, bears the fruit of the Spirit. Just a few verses before where the first reading begins today, it says, that desire, unruly desire, that Jesus speaks about in the gospel, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, begets death. So watch out what seeds are planted in your heart. When the seeds of the gospel are planted, the grace of the Spirit is supposed to bring forth the fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, faith, and goodness, kindness, as the fruits are named. So this is what's really important. You have to be very careful what is rooted in your heart. And it's easy sometimes for religious people, for the ego to take over and start replacing the true gospel with, arrogance, greed, all the customs of culture, etc. take over, and pretty soon you're not following the gospel at all anymore. So when the monks, the traditional monks, say, stand guard over the city of your heart like a sentinel, and everything that comes to the gate, you say, friend or foe, you can't come in here, or you can come in here. Because it's so important not to allow anything to take root or be planted in our soil, the soil of our hearts, that can then begin to grow and produce nefarious plants. Because as Jesus said, every tree, every plant that my Father has not planted will be rooted up. And the bad tree bears bad fruit, and the good tree bears good fruit. As St. Paul says, don't let the sun go down on your anger. If you're angry, make sure it doesn't take root. Make sure it's gotten rid of or dissipated or tended to or uprooted every day. This is the whole theology of St. Paul is about virtues and habits, following Aristotle. A virtue is a habit. It's something that takes root. It becomes part of you, for better or worse. If it's a vice, for worse. So that it becomes easy or very difficult to change and to grow and become the trees, whichever type they are, grow and put down deep roots and big branches, and pretty soon you're completely addicted to your vices, or you're running along the way of virtue with joy. So that's the kind of thing we have to be careful of, being rooted in our hearts. And whatever our religious tradition is, it should allow us and help us to do that. And I think these two things, the true law and these seeds planted in our hearts, come together very simply in the notion of love. Even the scribe asks Jesus in the gospel, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, to love the Lord your God with your whole heart, soul, strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And he says, all the law, all the Torah, all the prophets are meant to help you do that. That's the critique of all religions. Everything should be geared to love, and if it's not producing love in you, you're not doing it right. You're not understanding your tradition correctly. And St. Paul says the same thing. All the commandments can be summed up in love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no ill to the neighbor, therefore love is the fulfillment of the whole law. And why Jesus himself said just before he died, one new commandment I give you, to love one another as I have loved you. And by this will all people know that you are my disciples, or not, if you have love for one another. So that's the seed that has to take root in our hearts. And if our religious practices help us to do that, fine. And if not, change the way you're doing them, or change them. Because it's all geared to love. That is the one law we have. Love and do what you will, as St. Augustine said. It's very challenging. But that's the one seed we must constantly allow to be planted in our hearts. And it is actually possible, as the saints of all traditions tell us, it is actually possible to have every thought, remember you're standing sentry over the gate, every thought every day can become a thought of love. Every single thing that happens to you can be metabolized into love. Whatever happens, whoever happens to you. And you can be so filled with the fruits of the Spirit that that very first fruit, love, joy and peace, are what radiate from you. You can digest everything, and it comes out love. When you realize that that's what it's all about, all law and all spiritual practice, or all spiritual practices and traditions are really about love, then you replace all that other stuff. The spiritual alchemy, and it's transformed into love. And it's actually possible. You can be loving, consciously, actively, and fully loving everyone all the time. And if that sounds impossible or ludicrous, then it just means we haven't gotten there yet. But it is possible. That's why we're sitting here, I hope, to make it possible. To live in such a way that we can love as God loves. God who is love, lest we forget. Whoever loves knows God and is born of God. And whoever says he loves God but hates his brother or sister is a liar. So let's purify our religious observance, purify our hearts and minds, and just love. That is what it's all about.